Welcome to the presentation this afternoon. Before I begin, I just have to say this is kind of nostalgic to me, memorable, because the last time I spent much time up here was 7 years ago when my wife and I got married. So, I'm Gary Benton, and today it's my privilege to welcome and introduce our speaker. Sort of what my background is, and I guess one of the reasons why we invited him was for the last 30 years, I've been studying health and trying to solve my own health issues, challenges, and 2.5 years ago, my wife, Tammy, ordered Dr. Campbell's book, The China Study, from Amazon.com, and it hadn't come out yet, so as soon as it came out in January, I think, we got it, and I read it, we both read it, and we were so impressed by that book that we've read hundreds of books on health over the years, and this one went right to the top of our charts and has stayed there for the last 2 years. And you'll get a taste, if you haven't read it yet, you'll get a taste of the information that Dr. Campbell is going to be bringing. This bringing him was about a year ago, was just a dream. But anyway, we're just very pleased that we can bring him here, and it's becoming a reality for us. I'd like to share 2 stories as we begin. When I was 4 years old, we had just moved here to College Place, and I was the youngest of 6 children. A lot of my siblings were out of the house and going to academy and other things, and I was playing around. And I picked up the camera, my parents' camera, and I must have, in playing with it anyway, I heard a click, a distinct click, and I thought, oh no, I think I've done something wrong. A little while later, my mom picked up the camera, and she turned to my sister Linda and said, "Linda, have you taken a picture?" And Linda said, "No." And she turned to me and said, "Gary, did you take a picture?" And I said, "No." I remember feeling so terrible when I said that, because it was the first time I can remember not telling the truth. I mean, clearly not telling the truth. Why didn't I tell the truth? Well, probably a lot of you can relate. I was afraid that I'd get in trouble if I did. In October of 1991, in the Atlantic Ocean, a storm was developing. There were some major weather patterns that began to converge, and a type of storm called a nor'easter was off the east coast of Canada and the US, and the waves were beginning to get larger as the wind increased. A sword fishing boat named the Andrea Gale was caught in the storm and began to fight to stay afloat. The story of the Andrea Gale became a best-selling book called The Perfect Storm, and later that was made into a movie by the same title. As the storm developed into a tropical cyclone, and then into a full-blown hurricane, the waves reached over 30 feet high. The Andrea Gale went down in that storm, causing a loss of 6 lives. The term "the perfect storm" has come to symbolize any crisis. In our country, a perfect storm has been developing for many years in the area of health. Diabetes rates have skyrocketed in the last few years. And obesity also has skyrocketed, indicating a state of declining general health in our country. Many experts are saying that the perfect storm is beginning to happen in the area of health. And compounding that is another factor is that the cost of medical care has doubled every 10 years for the last at least 40 years. And in the next 10 years, experts are predicting that it will double again. Is it possible for you and I to ride out this storm that's coming, this perfect storm? Is there a way to turn off or even reverse the progression of cancer, heart disease, and diabetes? Dr. Campbell is here today to help us answer those questions. Bringing a world-renowned researcher with such impeccable credentials to our valley is, as you can probably guess, not without expense. Our goal one of our goals is to bring in more speakers, such as Dr. Campbell, who can share with us. And so we invite your support in this mission that we feel like we've been impressed to do. So at the end of the program today, we'll be taking up a free will offering. And so we invite your support. I would like to thank Coffee Communications for their generous support, encouragement. They made a nice contribution to help with this. Also like to thank Blue Mountain Television for airing the announcements and the Valley Viewpoint program, and Village Church Television for videoing this event, and of course the Village Church for opening up the church for this meeting. If you appreciate this information and would like to share it with others later, we will have DVDs and audio CDs available on our website at bentonhealthpromotions.com. T. Colin Campbell began his life on a dairy farm in the Midwest, and from what I've heard, from about age 5, he started milking cows and working on the farm. As a young man, he studied at Cornell University and MIT in the areas of nutrition, biochemistry, and toxicology. He worked for a few years in the Philippines trying to end malnutrition and hunger among the children there. And then one of his major next steps was to work in China on the most comprehensive study of nutrition that's ever been carried out, and which is known today as the China Study. The China Study book explains in an easily understandable way the impressive amount of evidence in favor of a lifestyle that has the power to save us from the perfect storm. Dr. Campbell and his wife Karen have 5 children, now grown. They live in Ithaca, New York, which is in upstate New York. I've been around New York a little bit, and Ithaca is a community way away from New York City, and small town about the size of Walla Walla, apparently. Their son, the Campbell's son, Thomas, took 2 years, I understand, out of his budding career to help his father write the book. Came home and helped him with that. I have a feeling that Dr. Campbell enjoys his family, his children. He has 5 grandchildren, I believe, and I'm sure he plans to be around for many more years to enjoy them. During Dr. Campbell's 40 years of research, he has come to conclusions that have not been popular, but the information he's discovered has the power to change people's lives. As a 4-year-old, I was afraid to tell the truth because I feared the consequences. During his career as a researcher, some of the things Dr. Campbell has discovered went directly against what the scientific community accepted as obvious fact. Friends and fellow scientists told him there must be a mistake, don't worry about these things, just sweep them under the rug, don't rock the boat. Dr. Campbell has sought out the truth and has told us the truth in spite of the consequences. Our nation and many of us as individuals are heading toward the perfect storm of a crisis in health and economics that could be disastrous. Dr. Campbell has earned my highest admiration because he has told the truth, regardless of the consequences, in order to help us to know how to avoid the perfect storm. Dr. Campbell has been called the Einstein of nutrition. He has spoken at Loma Linda University, Portland Adventist Medical Center, the Coronary Health Intervention Project, CHIP Summit, and now it is my distinct privilege to welcome Dr. Campbell to our community. Let's give a warm welcome to Dr. T. Colin Campbell.
Thank you, Gary. That is one of the warmest, most heartfelt introductions I've had. And I've had many during the last couple of years. I really feel at home. My wife and I have been here just a short time. And as Gary explained to you, we come from an area in upstate New York that some of you may know had you been there. That is not too different from this. Rolling hills, perhaps a little more, but in any case, countryside. I'm a countryside person, I'm a small town person, and so I feel very much at home here in College Place in the Walla Walla County or Valley, I guess you call it. It's my first time here, so it's very nice. I want to thank Gary for making this opportunity available to come and speak to you. And because in a sense, I've really become quite passionate about what I have come to believe. I'm supposed to be a scientist and be very objective and all that. But I've really personally, as well as professionally, have come to really have a lot of confidence in what this message is all about. And it's my delight, actually, to share it with you. Just the sum and substance of this, really, is that a diet, properly constituted and used, really has an amazing ability to create health, recreate health, prevent disease. It's really far beyond what, in fact, I thought when I first started my career. In fact, I would suggest for you thinking that nutrition as a topic, as a discipline, really ought to be the premier biomedical science. It's not. But at least for the future, I would like to have it considered that nutrition, if it's properly understood and practiced and used and professed and taught, really ought to be as I say, the premier biomedical science of the future. It's a complicated topic. Nutrition is confusing for a lot of people, as you know. I think, what do we have, 300 million people? I think sometimes we have 300 million different views of what nutrition is. There's a lot of confusion about nutrition. And I'm going to speak to this question a bit and share with you in this lecture and two more, incidentally, are coming up tomorrow, some ideas that, to me, even though nutrition as a biological science is very complex, nonetheless, we can actually sort of see this elephant in the room, and we can get a feel for it. We can know what it can do. Now, it's just a question of, and it's not that difficult. It's not that difficult. I'm really confident that if it's told properly, and if people use it as it's meant to be used, and to see what it can do, they will become quite convinced it's not that difficult. Now, there's various ways of, it's actually 51 years ago, this August, that I started my graduate career at Cornell University, starting down this path of working on diet and health. It's been quite a long time. And I've been graced with a lot of excellent students, colleagues, professors at different institutions, Cornell University in particular, but elsewhere, outside of the United States. And I really owe them my gratitude for the kind of work that they were able to do to allow me these days to be able to tell the story. And although this topic is, as I said, is biologically complex, and it means that there's various ways of telling it without getting too confused. And so when my son, our son, Tom, our youngest son, joined me to do the book, he incidentally had been a graduate in theater at Cornell University and was an aspiring actor in Chicago, doing well. Good communicator, came back home, worked with me for 3 years, excellent writer, and so we together actually wrote this book, and he made the readability of the book very much possible, together with my wife's critique and review of the manuscript as we went forward. But in any case, on the question of how to tell the story, there's various ways of doing it, because it is a big story. It has more to do than just with the food you decide to put in your mouth. It has many consequences. It has many consequences for us personally. It has many consequences for our family, of course, and our friends. It has many consequences indeed for our environment. It has many consequences for our society. And Gary, of course, alluded to that. There is a perfect storm. The perfect storm has started. And so let me get started then and just share with you first the different kinds of things. Let's give you a little hint of how sometimes difficult it is to tell the story, to tell a simple story that really is quite complex. But in any case, let's have a first slide here and see what we can get. I mean, following that statement, I think I forgot to finish the sentence before. My passion is that it's all about consuming plant-based foods. Vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes. And consuming in their whole form, not taking the stuff out of them like sugar and white flour and oil. That doesn't quite do it. And we're talking about the whole foods and good quality whole foods. Now, as far as telling the story is concerned, a lot of it for me centers on something that really has been kind of hidden from view, I would suggest, not necessarily intentionally, but it's a story that hasn't really been well understood and certainly not told. And it has to do with our reverence for protein. If you think of all the nutrients present in food, there's one nutrient that seems to stand out tall. People worry, as if in fact they change their diets, they worry about where they're going to get their protein from. Protein is, I would argue, has been kind of ignored except for advocating its great properties of creating health. It's kind of been ignored. And our assumptions that we've made about protein have in fact historically driven greatly the kind of dietary practices we have, and has driven greatly the kind of science we practice, and has driven greatly the kind of medicine, in fact, we practice too. When I was growing up at the farm, to the extent I even heard the word nutrition or anything about it, and milking cows, I knew, I think for one thing, that cow's milk was the nearest thing as the food from heaven that you could get. And it was valuable because of its content of protein. It was this high quality protein that was so important. It's one of the things that was actually said about dairy, you must consider good protein. That's not quite the way it should be. That became the early part of my career and consumed much of my interest for much of my career, and I'm going to tell you why I think that's not quite true. Naked reductionism. This says something about science. It says something about the practice of medicine. Reductionism means looking at the trees instead of the forest. That's really what it is. And it means, in fact, not just looking at the trees, it means studying the trees in great detail, with great depth. And that's really what science tends to do. It tends to study individual nutrients or individual diseases or individual so-called mechanisms of action in isolation of the rest of the whole. And we do it well in science. It's a lot of fun. But what we don't do well is to sit back and look, at this massive amount of information and try to draw from that, what is it really telling us? Is there a forest here? And so I get concerned, in fact, both in the practice and the art of doing scientific research as well as in practice of medicine, I get concerned with the fact that we are too reductionists, and therein lies much of the confusion. Because when we study things in isolation, we can often show opposite effects, contrasting effects if you use different systems. It's a source of great confusion. Policy shenanigans. I spent about 20 years of my career, almost continuously, almost a 20-year period, involved in being a member of a so-called expert panel, involved in writing standards or developing dietary and health policy for our country, for other countries. And I actually was in a place where I saw firsthand the interface between science and policy. The interface where a group of people get together, so-called experts get together and see what is there and then decide to tell the public what they want to tell them. It's not a very pleasant story, to be honest about it, but it certainly is a very important story and something we have to understand. NIH ownership. NIH is the National Institutes of Health. It's a U.S. government agency responsible for conducting and funding biological and medical research in this country in large measure. They fund the majority of the research in this country. And the research that tends to get published in so-called peer-reviewed journals, for the most part, has been funded by NIH and or, in some cases, by organizations like the American Cancer Society, American Heart Association, and so forth. NIH is the agency, the institution that drives much of the thinking as far as the kind of research we tend to do. It's taxpayer money. It's your money. It's your money. And we ought to be using NIH, we ought to be using that kind of funding to look at evidence in a very objective way. And unfortunately, I don't feel that's true. Institutionally, systemically, I have learned that although most of the people are very good people, hardworking, honest people who are working in this discipline, on the one hand, they're somehow missing this, the overarching sort of thing that tends to drive the NIH budget. And that, unfortunately, there's somebody I'm suggesting owns NIH in a sense, and I'm going to say that it's largely the pharmaceutical industry. They get their way in seeing what's developed. And the majority of the public these days tend to think that drugs is the primary source of health instead of food. I have a different view. Defining nutrition, defining health, defining medicine, important concepts. When I started my career, we were taught something about nutrition. Of course, I did my major field of study for my doctorate was in nutrition. We actually, in those days and still today, most people do this, they learn about nutrition as to what individual vitamins and minerals and macronutrients do. And as I mentioned before, this is a very reductionist point of view, studying things in isolation like that. My views today are very different. As I indicated earlier, it's more about food. All this stuff working together. It's a big difference, a huge difference. And this in turn translates into some rather different views about what health really is and how we should think about it, how we can restore it. And it really has a lot to do with the practice of medicine, a lot. And I may not say too much in this particular lecture, but in the next two I certainly will get into that. Slimmer wallets really refers to the fact, Gary alluded to it, it really has to do with the fact that we today are spending an awful lot of money to not get much health. Just as a statistic, for example, the United States, their per capita medical care cost in this country is the highest in the world. It's 50% higher than number 2. I mean, we're way out in front. Yet when our medical system, our healthcare system is compared with other countries in the world, using various criteria, we stand somewhere in the neighborhood of 30th to 40th. We're down the list. How can we spend so much money and get so little in return? That's the storm. That's the storm that's beginning to rise. And the cost, in fact, slimming our wallets is breaking the bank. It's breaking our personal banks, it's breaking our corporate bank. Okay, now to get into my story. As I said, there's so many different ways to tell this. When we were doing the book, we were sort of thinking, well, how do we do this? We have a chapter on protein, a chapter on carbohydrate, a chapter on this, a chapter on that. No, I mean, that was a traditional way of thinking about it. So I didn't know how to do it, really, and we talked about it, my son and I finally said, well, why don't I just tell this story as I learned it? Because obviously, I got to a place in my career where I think something very differently. And why don't I just tell it? You know, this is the stuff that influenced me, right or wrong, and let the reader decide for themselves. And so, as Gary indicated, and as I already said, I started on a farm. And that picture here, an old picture that my mother retrieved, I just show it to you to make sure that you know I came from the farm. That's me just there by the steering wheel in the front, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, something like that. Then I was off to graduate school at Cornell University, where I did a doctorate in nutrition, a major in nutrition, minors in biochemistry and microbiology. And this is the title of the thesis that I did. And this, incidentally, was taken from the farm into the laboratory, an idea that I sort of held dear. It was basically a project that was designed to try to figure out how to grow animal protein more effectively, because that was the big thing. That was the big thing. Make sure everybody had enough protein. And this title is a little bit technical, but it refers to a compound called biuret, which is a non-protein nitrogen substance that we were feeding to cattle in order to see if, in fact, these cattle could actually use that kind of material to make protein as they consumed it. So it was, as I said, it's all about protein. And then it was off to the Philippines. My first professorship was at Virginia Tech for 10 years, and while I was there, I was in charge of a nationwide program of feeding malnourished children with my senior colleague, who at the time was the dean of the college. And malnutrition in the third world is a serious problem. It was certainly then, still is. This is, of course, an unfortunate consequence. And when we look at a question concerning how to feed malnourished children, we tend to think in the professions about malnourishment being either due to an inadequate intake of calories, just simply not enough food, or inadequate intake of protein. Not enough calories means a condition called marasmus. Not enough protein means a condition called kwashiorkor. And so the question concerning inadequate intake of protein, that was my calling in a sense. It was, you know, let's make sure these kids get enough protein. And we therefore worked on that project in the Philippines in large measure to try to assure that there was an adequate consumption of protein by these kids. In average in the Philippines, they were only consuming about 75% as much protein as we do. And it was only a small fraction of people who, maybe 1 or 2% of the families, were rich enough to afford, you know, the richer Western diet, higher in protein. And so I was all enthused about, you know, with Dr. Engel, my senior colleague at the time, putting together a program to get more protein into them. But then one day when I was playing golf, which I like to do, with the medical advisor to the president of the Philippines, he, being a surgeon, told me about how he and some of his surgeon colleagues had operated on children aged 4 and under for primary liver cancer, a fatal disease. And I had an interest in liver cancer, by the way. I had a general interest in cancer, and particularly in liver cancer. And I knew that sounded very strange, because liver cancer tends to only occur in people middle-aged and older. Children get a liver cancer. It didn't make sense. And then, I didn't, to be honest about it, make too much of it, but certainly heard his comment. Then learned not too long after that it seemed like the children who were most susceptible to getting liver cancer were coming from families who were the best fed. They were the few families who, in fact, were consuming the adequate levels of protein. And all of a sudden, you know, something's going on in my head. Wait a minute. Protein is so important. Why are we going to the Philippines trying to get all these kids to consume the level up to the level of the few people who, in fact, ran a risk, possibly, of their children getting liver cancer? So that was controversial, to say the least, that protein might have something to do with turning on cancer. And it wasn't published, it was just an observation, just a personal observation. But it was at that time then that this report was published in 1968. An experimental bit of research on experimental animals, rats, done in India, where they were basically examining the effect of protein feeding on liver cancer, a kind of liver cancer that was thought to be rather similar to human liver cancer. And so their hypothesis was that if they fed really good levels of protein, the kind that we tended to aspire to, like 20% of total calories, that would prevent the cancer from forming. And incidentally, in this particular experimental setting, these animals had been exposed to an experimental carcinogen that causes liver cancer. So they fed the regular levels, the good levels, the healthy levels, and they fed the much lower levels of protein, 5% of calories. The level that's considered not enough, that's not enough. The rats, which incidentally in this case need about the same amount of protein as we do, as humans, both species needing about 10% or so protein diets. When they're fed 5%, that was considered to be enough. And so what did they get? They got the opposite result. The animals fed the higher levels of protein, 20%. You could see that all of the animals got liver cancer in this small study. In contrast, the animals fed to 5%, none did. You don't need a statistician to decide whether or not that's statistically significant. That appeared to me to be real, but even more to the point, it coincided with what I thought I was seeing with children. Higher protein intake being associated with more cancer. So then we came home. I got involved with NIH money, who in fact were very generous with me over the years in funding this research in large measure. It was all published in the very best journals, I must tell you. I have to say that because otherwise people hear this and they say, oh, it's a bunch of quackery. It's not. It was reviewed by my peers in order to get this very competitive funding, and it was also reviewed by my peers when it was published in the very best journals. In any case, we spent the next 27 years with National Institutes of Health funding on this particular project, examining this question. And I started out with sort of two questions in a general way. First, I wanted to repeat the study that the Indian people had done. I mean, maybe it's wrong. So we just wanted to demonstrate, confirm it. The second thing we wanted to do, and we do this in science, we wanted to figure out, how does it work? If we know how it works, if we know what the mechanism is, as we say, we get more confidence in understanding that it's for real. So we started out the study, and I'm going to show you just a couple of charts here that illustrate some of the more essential features of our finding. This is a display showing the development of early cancer in rats as a function of feeding either 20 or 5% protein diets. 20% the good level, 5% the inadequate level. Over the first 12 weeks, we had ways of actually being able to see, measure cancer develop in its very early stages. You can see 20% just really grows these cancers like gangbusters, straight off over the first 12 weeks. The 5% did not. So at this point, I said, wow, I think we confirmed what the Indian workers observed. I think we also confirmed what, in fact, I thought I was seeing in these children. But then the next part of the study was kind of interesting. We did this in many different ways, just as this one little sample. Namely, we wanted to ask this question: what happens as these tumors start to grow? And you change the level of protein intake, for example, a nutrient, a good old nutrient. By the way, protein is an essential nutrient. We have to have protein, up to about 10%, by the way. We need about 10% or so. But in any case, protein is. What happens if we sort of intervene along this process? And let's say give them 20%, the higher level, for the first 3 weeks. You can see these cancers are forming as expected. And so then we turn around and give them 5%. Switch them. We turn off the cancer. We put back the higher protein back again and we turn it on. and then turn it off. In other words, what we were demonstrating here was that we could turn on and turn off tumor development, cancer development, just by feeding protein at these higher levels or taking it away. Now, one of the questions I'm sure you must have right now, and I'll come back to this in a moment, it's worth repeating a few times. The question is, what levels do we consume as humans? We're somewhere in the neighborhood, 95% of us at least, are in the neighborhood of consuming between about 10% and 22% or 23%. We are in the area where this effect, if it exists in humans like it does in animals, we're in an area where we maybe should be concerned about this kind of question. But this is early cancer. So now let's take a look and see what happens. And mind you, these experiments I'm telling you is not to conclude something really big about liver cancer. It's the kind of observations that sort of directed my thinking as the kind of research that we subsequently did. This second chart on this study shows what happens when you feed different levels of protein over a lifetime, not just the first 12 weeks, over a lifetime. And as part of this study, and I'm not showing it, we also intervene late in the cancer process too to see what happens. But let me just show you these very simple end results. Animals fed 20%. Look at the number on your right, the 3321. That shows the extent to which cancer is growing, considering the numbers of tumors and the size of the growth and so forth. 3321, the animals given 5%, really essentially nothing. To the naked eye, examining them, you couldn't see any cancer. This is only just under a microscope, you can see this kind of thing. So again, by this time, I was convinced we had confirmed in spades the work that the Indian workers had done. And that is the higher protein intake, and didn't need to go very high either, up to 20% could really turn this thing on. But then it became even more dramatic in that the animals fed 5% protein, usually considered not being able to live a normal lifetime. Here they're all living. And they're thrifty. And their coats are sleek hair coats, and they're energetic, and they're jumping around the cage, which was incidentally an observation in and of itself that was worth considering. But they were really very much active, alive, and no tumors, in spite of the fact they had received so little protein. Incidentally, when we as adults, or the animals, of course, as they mature and become adults, we don't actually need about 10% at that point. We need even much less. Well, I shouldn't say much less, maybe 5 or 6%, not the 10%. So that's why 5%, if they can survive growing slower, when you get adults, that 5% is enough. So in any case, the 20%, all these animals had died of liver cancer. Again, really a major observation, and done many, many different ways. I wish I could have the time to tell you. I've given lectures on this to researchers and medical students and conferences going into a lot of the details of this. I don't get a lot of argument with the essence of the research. I get a lot of silence. I think it's probably the best reaction that I can describe. Oh, okay, so now the second question was, how does it work? Well, I was interested, as any of us are interested, and I'm saying THE, what's the mechanism of action? And so we looked for a mechanism of action. We had lots of ideas. I'm trained in biochemistry. I'm particularly interested in biochemical and clinical kinds of things. And so we looked at reactions having to do with the early stages, which we call initiation. We looked at reactions having to do with later stages, which is called promotion. And what came out of this was that every time we looked for the mechanism, this elusive mechanism, every time we looked for a mechanism, we found one. I mean, just to put it bluntly. It was frustrating. How could you decide? I mean, everything is going wrong. How can you decide what counts and what doesn't? I mean, that turned out to be, in reflection, really a major consideration of my later thinking, because it turns out when protein is fed at these higher levels, at least as far as this cancer is concerned, everything is going wrong. There's a sea change in all kinds of things going on, and basically all in the same direction, kind of feeding, essentially, feeding the outcome. So now the question, what kind of protein were we using to cause this? We were using the same protein that researchers across all laboratories tended to use in those days, readily available. It's the main protein of cow's milk, casein. It represents about 87% of cow's milk protein. That's what we could turn on tumors with. We took it away, or at least lowered to substantial levels, we could slow it down. Soy protein and wheat protein, two plant proteins, did not do this, even when they were fed at the 20% level. So all of a sudden, now it's coming into view something really pretty dramatic, especially considering many of the other kinds of research we did that I'm not sharing with you. It turned out, on the one hand, it seemed like animal protein in the form of casein was operating to create cancer. Plant proteins in opposition did not. That was one of the simplistic sort of things that popped up. For me, that's why I showed you the picture of having been raised on a farm and saying I grew up sort of milking cows. Because, it's a difficult thing, you're really challenging. I'm challenging, for me, my own sort of education, my own thinking, challenge to say nothing of the challenge in the literature from my colleagues. But it's kind of a difficult thing, and I knew that even talking about this kind of thing was not the most popular thing in the world, at least in the medical community. And I thought we really had to do it well, and we had to do it, thoroughly. And I finally had to come to terms. Cow's milk protein. Cow's milk protein. If it is considered by the criteria, the experimental criteria that are used to decide which chemicals cause cancer and which don't, and there's very formal rules about this, and there's formal programs to do this. If we consider it according to those formal rules, I think it's fair to suggest that cow's milk protein is probably the most significant, most relevant chemical carcinogen we consume. How many of you have heard that cow's milk protein is a chemical carcinogen? Minus the people who read the book. Anyway, it's not a very popular topic, to say the least. And one of the effects, of course, as I say, the effect that I consider really significant, and I'll return to this, is the fact that it involves multiple mechanisms. It's not one, which incidentally, that's the essence of Western medicine. It's one of the essential features of Western medicine. We take one chemical, we call it a drug. We create one kind of response we're more or less interested in, and we describe it by one way in which it works. This is what this was challenging. That's a false assumption. Now, before passing on to the next stage of research studies, I wanted to show you this. Just to put things in a little perspective, we wanted to know, in this case, we had used 5% and 20%, as you have seen. We wanted to know, what about the in-between levels? And so we did this study, and this is basically what we found. If we feed like 4%, 6%, 8%, 10%, up to the level that's needed for maximum growth rate, cancer is not promoted. And it's actually when we get an excess of that, it's almost as if the body's telling us something. Look, I need this much. Give me this much. I'll do well on this. But don't go so far overboard. If you start going overboard, you're going to get into trouble. And this kind of experiment, although it is related to experimental tumors in experimental animals, the same kind of sort of dynamics seem to play too in some of the other effects that protein causes as well. So now come to this a new question in a sense, and that is, I've become somewhat critical, and gradually I was sort of coming to learn that to be critical about so-called reductionist research, studying single nutrients in isolation. And so it had to apply to our work too. We're using in a sense a single nutrient, protein. We're looking at a single outcome, liver cancer in this case. And also we're using experimental animals, my goodness. How does that fit into the scheme of things? And does that fit into a larger worldview? And so we wanted to seek a larger context. We could ask questions like this, and I'll just go through with you a sequence of questions you can ask. We did ask, I'd ask. Maybe casein is representative of animal protein in general. Maybe it's not just specific for cow's milk protein. Maybe other animal proteins do like this too. And although we haven't done all those kind of studies, I'm really confident other animal proteins do this too. Of that, I have little or no doubt. Secondly, it's not just about animal protein, or it's not just about protein in animal-based foods. That's the only thing that animal-based foods have. They have all kinds of nutrients too. And maybe one could argue, yeah, protein can do this if you test it alone, but all this other stuff in there kind of turns it around, keeps it under control, it doesn't make any difference. So the larger question, larger context question is, maybe animal protein might be representative of animal foods. And maybe the problem was animal foods, if this protein thing is meaning anything. But then again, it's not a question of necessarily consuming too much animal foods. You know, when we consume more animal foods, and we get really liking our steak and stuff, you know, bigger steaks, we kind of push the peas and the beans to the side. And so we tend to consume more and more animal-based foods and less animal and plant-based foods. And so maybe we got to think about, you know, what's plants doing in this equation? Well, we've since learned, especially having the advantage of hindsight, that plant-based foods are really good to prevent cancer. So we're expanding, we're getting a sort of kind of a bigger view here. We want to know too whether this applies to humans. I've showed you mostly about experimental animals, and we'd like to know for ourselves as well. I'm just not only interested in saving all the rats of the world. Other disease conditions. Finally, you know, let's say we're learning something about cancer. We're learning something about a dietary condition that promotes cancer or prevents it. I want to know what it means also for other disease conditions and other ailments as well. And common sense told me that it would be a heck of a notion if somehow the natural order of things had been such that we would have to consume one kind of diet to prevent cancer, but a different kind of diet to prevent heart disease, and maybe yet another one to prevent diabetes or something like that. I mean, common sense sort of told me that if we're discovering something pretty fundamental here about cancer as far as diet is concerned, it ought to apply to other diseases as well. But we had to show it. We have to get the evidence to understand that a little bit better. And so that was the opportunity that came along to the China project that we did, a human study, where we could actually sort of test this larger context. We could test all kinds of things about food and maybe some other disease as well. But before I get into that study, at the time we were organizing this, and incidentally, this study came about in the early 1980s, right after our two countries started to talk to each other again. And the first senior scientist from China to come to the United States came to my laboratory, Dr. Chen Zhizhi, and it was a jointly funded project between the United States and China. It was the first project, in fact, funded between our two countries. So it took on some importance straight off, I guess. But before we get involved in doing that study, before I show you the results, just a very snippet of the results, I should say, this kind of information here was available. And what this shows here is that there can be a dietary effect, or a dietary association, I should say, with a disease condition, if we compare different countries. In this case, what's being compared here, and this was done by my late friend, Professor Ken Carroll in Canada, what he was able to show back in the 60s and 70s was that if you compare a bunch of different countries, as breast cancer is increased, that's on the up axis, as breast cancer in this case is increased, it increases in concert with increases in, and I got to make a correction here, he actually had total fat. I'm sorry, I got the wrong slide here, but he was actually showing that the higher the fat intake, the higher the breast cancer risk. And it was that observation, his work and others, that actually led to the widespread policy position in this country some 30 years ago for everybody to start using low-fat foods. Skim milk was in. Cutting down on butter was a good thing to do. Using lean cuts of meat was an ideal thing to do. You know, this kind of thing. Because it was an attempt to try to reduce our fat intake. That was too narrow on the part of Professor Carroll and the rest of us who got interested in that. This is before the China study. And so what later turned out, I'm kind of jumping ahead to explain my misplacement of this slide. What later turned out is that instead of that being total fat, it should have been animal protein. It should be animal food. But anyhow, let me just skip beyond that. We can maybe come back to that later. The other thing I want to show you about this slide here, first off, it says, diet can make a difference. Yeah, it's association. It doesn't necessarily prove causality, as we say, but it's an important association. Striking difference. Some areas in the world really don't have any breast cancer. And incidentally, this chart also applies to coronary heart disease, colon cancer, and some others that were studied in those days too. The other thing is, see that curved arrow there? That basically kind of summarizes a bunch of studies showing that when people move from one area of the world to another, keep their genes the same, by the way. That is to say, they're not intermarrying with the local population. As they move to a second area and change their diet and lifestyle, they get the disease risk of the country to which they move. And it was that observation, done many times, that suggested that cancer and other diseases were very likely related to diet and lifestyle, not to genes. And actually, that conclusion now is much more robust than it was before, even. So the Chinese had actually, at the time that Dr. Chen visited, were just then releasing and publishing this major study of how much cancer existed in their country, in a total of about 2,400 counties across the country. And what they were able to show in these atlases that were being published, these beautiful color-coded atlases, was that even in a case like breast cancer, colon cancer, and so forth and so on, these cancers tend to be very concentrated in just very specific areas. They were geographically localized. And from a research point of view, that was really an interesting observation, because it meant we could go to China, if we could examine things, maybe we'll learn something about what are the factors that cause cancer to be so high here and so low there. That was the issue. And so it was really a unique opportunity. It was also a unique opportunity in another sense, and that is that the Chinese, in rural China, where we did the study, in rural China, they were consuming a diet that had very little animal food, not very much. And although I had an interest in what might happen when people start consuming animal food, I didn't really think that we would necessarily see anything, because I didn't think that much, only consuming relatively small amounts of animal food, that's not enough to make a difference. This study was organized to include counties across the country, 65 counties, 2 villages in every county, 130 villages. We went there and actually collected food intake over a 3-day period and measured it very precisely. My Chinese colleagues did that. I did not do that. Measured very precisely. We could calculate nutrient intakes. We asked questions: do you smoke? How long have you been smoking? What kind of cigarettes? Things like that. We collected blood samples, urine samples, food samples, and then about 24 different laboratories from around the world got involved with this and analyzed various and sundry things, from viruses to hormones to toxic metals to this, that, whatever. Here was one of the purposes for doing that, at least from my perspective, and that was to try to get a more comprehensive feel, for all the things that might work together to create a response like a cancer or heart disease. The other thing that the Chinese government did to us after we got involved was that they made available for us rates of disease other than cancer. They gave us information on about 36 other diseases, the rates of disease that they had. I mean, it was a fantastic opportunity. And we had ways of ascertaining the quality of these data, both the data we collected, because we had built into the system objective ways of being able to evaluate the question. We had ways also of ascertaining how reliable were these disease statistics. And so we really had a good data set. And I'm just going to briefly just summarize for you what more or less we saw. I mean, actually, we ended up with a huge body of data. The New York Times did a cover story in this project when it was first told, and called it the most comprehensive study ever done. I guess it is. And we ended up with 100,000, for those of you in science, 100,000 so-called correlations to consider. And I'm interested in looking at a whole other pattern. I want to get a picture of the forest. That's what I'm interested in. But here's a quick snapshot of the difference in the diets of rural China compared to the United States that's interesting to consider. Fat intake is quite high. in the United States is somewhere 35 to 40% of calories. In China, it was very low. Dietary fiber only comes from plant material. There's almost infinite varieties of fiber, by the way. But dietary fiber is much higher in plants, of course, and not even present in animal food. And they consume much more fiber. The animal protein one is the interesting one. And just consider it in relative terms. Namely, our diets, on average, have about 10 times the concentration of animal protein than rural Chinese did. 10 times. We are virtual carnivores. They're much more aligned with herbivores, not by choice necessarily. It's by the fact that they were poor and they couldn't afford the kind of foods, and especially animal-based foods, that we could. That's all changing now in China, by the way. The last two entries there is body mass index and energy intake. Body mass index is an indication of how much obesity existed in the country. We didn't see any obese people in rural China, virtually none. And their body weight, they were quite slim compared to us, using those data of those days. We've gotten worse since those data were first published. But in any case, one of the striking things was that in China, they were actually consuming more calories than we do. That was pretty striking for some people. Some people thought the Chinese were still having famines. And here they're consuming more calories than we do per unit of body weight, yet gaining less weight. That was a really interesting idea. How can that be? Well, they exercise more, of course. But get this comparison is for Chinese office workers who exercise the least. And they're still doing this. They still exercise more. They go to work on their bicycles they did in those days and stuff like that. But there was another element here working, and that is to say this. When you consume a diet low in fat, mostly plant-based, as they were doing, if you could do that, then you can begin to you can begin to control body weight. It works. So, we analyzed a lot of different stuff, and this kind of summarizes these associations to the extent that we actually analyzed all these data. There's still a lot more to do, but this is the main points. And I summarize it here. It says, for minimal disease risk, virtually all favor the nutrient composition of a plant-based diet. And I want to emphasize nutrient composition. I'm not saying anything about specific individual plants or individual vegetables, fruit. I'm simply talking about the dietary characteristics, nutritionally speaking. A diet that's lower in protein, lower in fat, higher in dietary fiber, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's the kind of diet that we're really seeing here that has this rather remarkable effect. Now, by this time, we have the experimental animal data, we have the people data, and of course there were others, laboratories doing something along these lines too. I mean, it was all adding up that, a plant-based diet has time had arrived, I think. This is more or less early 90s. But in any case, the question remains, what about some of these other diseases that we couldn't measure in China, we couldn't get much information on? So I knew some of this information by the time we wrote the book, but Tom and I got involved in going back to the literature and having a closer look. What do we know about some of these other diseases? I'm going to show you a thing, because it turns out this is very important. We want to expand the disease horizon, if you will. And one thing that came to my attention straight off was the work of this certain Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn at the Cleveland Clinic, a remarkable surgeon, one of the top doctors in the country, according to a list that was made. He had gotten a gold medal in the Olympics. He had gotten a Bronze Star in Vietnam. He was a president of Cleveland Clinic faculty and staff. He was one of the most practiced surgeons in the entire United States, now a very good friend. But he was starting this remarkable study. And what he did, we didn't know each other at the time he started it. What he did, he wanted to take a bunch of people who had heart disease, advanced heart disease, the people who, in fact, had been told by their doctors, time is up. They couldn't do more for them. And he took these people, he invited them into the study. He thought, let's try a low-fat, plant-based diet. He had his own reasons for deciding on that. It just so happens that he was coming to this view like I was, but from obviously different set of circumstances. And so he invited 24 people to join his study. 18 said, yeah, we'll join that. The other 6 said, no, we can't be bothered. Not going to do that. And so he met with them very carefully over the now 22 years he's followed them up. These were middle to elder age people at the time. These 18 people here's how seriously ill they were. These 18 people had had 49 coronary events between them in the previous 8 years before getting the study. What's a coronary event? Angioplasty, bypass surgery, an MI or a myocardial infarction, a heart attack, if you will. I mean, they had 49 coronary. Yeah, they were not only the walking wounded, they were in serious shape. So he put them on this crazy diet. And over the next, now it's 22 years, they went from 49 coronary events to 0. Isn't that pretty remarkable? I really think this is really one of the most dramatic, most important studies done during the last 100 years in many different ways. Because what he was doing was actually showing something we all did, in our views, didn't quite believe. You can't take people with advanced disease and do anything with it. It's too late. No. He was showing it it's not too late for these folks. There was actually one person who did get a problem along the way. That person, though, had strayed, didn't stick to the diet. He brought him back into the fold, and he got to be okay. 3 people have since passed away of the original cohort, but not from heart disease. And he was able to show, too, that he could actually show changes in their vessels. And now he's published a book. It just came out in February. I'd really suggest for your thinking to get the book, especially if you're interested in heart disease. It's called Prevent or Reverse Heart Disease, Caldwell Esselstyn. As I say, he's become a very good friend. In fact, just yesterday, he and I were on a panel together in Portland, just before I came here. Really, a most important study. Kind of coincides with the kind of thing that we were doing and demonstrating some important points. That's heart disease. Okay, now let's consider some others, because what I'm finding is that I just stumble from one heresy to another, it seems like. And just getting into trouble. But once you go down this path, you might as well go the whole way and just ask all kinds of questions. Here's some information on osteoporosis. Osteoporosis. You've heard about that. I'm sure most of you have. Women who reach the later ages, especially menopause, are urged to go get a bone density scan, all this kind of stuff to see how far down the line they are, and they're urged to do this, that, and something else. Well, let's find out something a little bit about osteoporosis. Here's a study that was published in 1992. Well, they can't do it that way. Published in 1992 at Yale University School of Medicine. Good study. Somewhat limited, but nonetheless a pretty good study. It shows that the higher the intake of dietary animal protein in different societies, the higher the bone fracture rate. And bone fracture rate is an indication of osteoporosis. The higher the animal protein, the higher the fracture rate. It's just a correlation, It doesn't necessarily suggest causality, but wow, there's something there. And I should show you the slide. I don't have it. If you also show the relationship between calcium intake and osteoporosis or fracture rate. The higher the calcium intake, the higher the fracture rate. So then you ask yourself, where do societies get their extra calcium and animal protein from? Dairy. So if you put on there dairy on the x-axis, the higher the dairy intake, the higher the osteoporosis rate. How long have we heard the views to the contrary? And now we know, I would suggest, quite a lot about how it really works. Animal protein, for example, creates an acidic environment. It does a bunch of different things, but it creates a bunch of different things that, in fact, begin to be explained by, problems with bones. That's not in accord with what, in fact, has been taught. Here's something kind of interesting. Incidentally, each one of these studies I'll show you has limitations, but the reason I'm showing to you because they are backed up by lots of other studies, or they're backed up by what we call biologically plausible mechanisms, things like that. Here's one. Here's the relationship between consuming skim milk. The thing we all told everybody should take because we got concerned with fat? Well, you take the fat out of milk, and what do you got? You got higher levels of protein. So the higher the skim milk intake, the higher the rates of prostate cancer. Dairy, in fact, has now been concluded in a study that summarized a bunch of studies at Harvard, has been concluded as probably the main culprit, food culprit for causing prostate cancer, cow's milk. And again, we know quite a bit about that. So now we got a couple of conditions here. Well, I didn't tell you. Let me go on just for a second. So as prostate cancer in men, we call it a reproductive cancer or a cancer of the reproductive tract. Here's for women, breast cancer. This just published recently. The higher the milk consumption, the higher the rates of breast cancer. And I wish I had the time to, maybe I'll show you some of this in the next couple of lectures possibly. But we know a lot too about that. And it turns out that, I'll just reserve those comments for later, but we see the strong relationship with milk and breast cancer. And so too, we also see it for uterine cancer. Same kind of correlation. So what do you got? Prostate cancer, breast cancer, uterine cancer, showing this really impressive, strong relationship with dairy. And we know quite a lot about it from the nutritional point of view. So that's just a tiny little snapshot. And I just want to summarize what could be, a few hours of lecture about each of these others that are listed in this list. And it turns out that there is good literature in the scientific literature, not well publicized to say the least, that's showing that when we consider animal-based foods versus, and I have to emphasize whole, when we consume animal-based versus whole foods, whole vegetables and fruits and grains, I'm not talking about the stuff we get out of boxes, processed foods. I'm talking about whole vegetables, fruits, and so forth. With animal foods, all these diseases, some of them very serious, fatal, in many cases, some of them just illnesses, troublesome, irritations. It turns out this dietary effect of switching from an animal food-based diet to a plant food-based diet, it has a broad sweep of an effect. It works for all of these. And so to go back to the question I was asking before, what about other diseases? It turns out, and so many of my colleagues just want to dispute this. I say that one message virtually fits all. People don't like to hear that. They don't like to hear that, and they want to challenge me. And the reason they have a good reason for challenging, incidentally, if they start from the wrong worldview. If I were telling you that I had a chemical that could provide some benefits for this disease, and then turn around and tell you, oh, by the way, that chemical also has the same good effects on all these others, I would be wrong. I would be wrong. We don't have those kind of magic bullets, and I'm sure we never will when we talk about single things like that. But that's not what I'm saying here in this case. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that a plant-based diet has the tens or hundreds of thousands of different kinds of things in it, all working together. It's just sort of, that's what I'm talking about. And you can there's infinite ways of making a plant-based diet, just as long as it has good color, good quality, things like this, will in fact have a beneficial effect on all these diseases. And the effect is major. It's really major. So I have a new definition for nutrition. Instead of thinking about nutrition just in a single nutrients kind of thing, I say it involves the integrated effects. That's where that multi-mechanistic kind of consideration I ask you to think about. It involves the integrated effects of countless foods constituents. When we eat food, we're eating tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands, I don't know. It's your guess as good as mine. Maybe a million different kinds of chemicals in food. And the interesting thing about this is that all this stuff kind of works together. And the body knows how to work with this. I really want to come back to this point of view later on, because it's really quite a dramatically different view to consider, and it has so much promise. But in any case, I went ahead of myself. It involves infinitely complex mechanisms, yes, and it produces comprehensive benefits. But the message is pretty simple, and that's just basically consuming plant-based foods, whole plant-based foods. And here's, I kind of like this analogy, this metaphor. Nutrition, when it's supported by exercise, of course, which is important. Exercise and food kind of go together, each reinforcing the other in many ways. Nutrition is supported by exercise, adequate hydration or adequate intake of water, very important. some sunshine, very important. In any case, nutrition is greater than the sum of its parts. It's like a symphony. And I like that metaphor because if you go to a concert and you want to listen to a symphony, and there's one person on the stage and only got one instrument there, it's not quite a symphony, especially if they're only there just banging away on one note the whole 2 hours. And that's what we tend to do in science, I think. We bang on one note, forever, all our lives, and think we've created something that's pretty. That's not quite right. When you put it all together, there's something else that happens. So there's a lot of possibilities. So my best case solution to this idea that I will expand on in the next 2 lectures is that plant-based diets, and again I emphasize, these are whole, unprocessed vegetables, fruits, grains, legumes, nuts, which happens to be high-carb diets, by the way. Thank you, Dr. Atkins. Low fat, low protein. Plant-based diets enhance health and prevent and/or cure a broad range of diseases. And that is a big, big message. It's profound, it has breadth, and I think we can really get on to living a better life if we start taking this seriously and understanding it. Thank you very much for your attention. As I said, thank you very much. In the next lecture, I'm going to expand on some of this and tell you some things that may even shock you more if you think this hasn't shocked you enough. As to, particularly on the question concerning, why haven't you heard this before? That's, I find it kind of exciting, yes.
Dr. Campbell, this has been awesome. This is something I've looked forward to for several years. Life is a journey. It's a journey in which we learn all kinds of things that are sad, things that are exciting. A lot of us like to read. We read lots of things, magazines, books, articles. We watch videos, DVDs. Once in a while, we read something that our brain says, boy, this is good stuff. It was about 2 years ago, my daughter-in-law gave me a copy, The China Study. I could not put that book down when I got into it. I literally devoured that book in 2 sittings. And then I went back, underlined, highlighted. How often in life do you read something that changes your life for the better forever? Where truth speaks so valiantly to your mind. You say, why? Like Dr. Campbell just said, why haven't I heard this message before? We have an opportunity to show our gratitude to Dr. Campbell for taking time in his busy schedule to coming to our little agricultural community here, the Walla Walla Valley, where there are a lot of farms, and sharing with us his life study in nutrition to help us have a more exciting, more joyful, more abundant life.
Thank you so much for coming. We will take probably just 15 minutes for a question and answer period. So at this time, you're welcome to leave if you would like to, or stay for the question and answer period. We'll have some roving mics, and just raise your hand if you have a question. So.
Have you done any work in the South Pacific with the coconut oil diet?
I'm sorry, where is this person? Okay, yeah, I'm sorry. Coconut oil?
In the South Pacific.
No, I have not been involved in that kind of work at all. I know something about coconuts. I don't use the word diet, really. I try not to use it, well, I should say. I don't like to think of it as a diet. It's a kind of dietary lifestyle. And every time I sort of hear a diet, like there's a grapefruit diet, and there's a low-carb diet, and there's a coconut diet, and there's this and that, there's so much focus on one thing. I really have trouble with that, even though it may have elements of truth. Some people would argue that coconuts are not that good because the oil that's present in the coconut is so-called saturated, like animal food. It's one of the rare animal fats that happen to be saturated, so they'll suggest that it might raise the risk of heart disease. I've never quite believed that, but anyhow, that's the kind of argument that's used. So I don't know that diet. Certainly haven't done any research on it.
A couple things. First, calcium pills. Second, arthritis.
What's the first one?
Calcium pills.
Oh, calcium pills. Wow. You know, when people reach the stage of life where their losses of bone is greater than what it otherwise should be, perhaps, especially because they're losing calcium, it was reasonable to assume that, you know, taking some calcium supplements might help. And there's some evidence to suggest that, yeah, there's some evidence, not all, some evidence to suggest that it may tend to attenuate calcium loss. But in that process, what is not mentioned, or rarely mentioned, I should say, is the fact that consuming animal protein-based foods actually tend to accelerate calcium loss because of the acidity that is produced. The acidity, in this case, coming from the animal protein, needing to be neutralized, the body calls on the best buffer it has, and that's the calcium. So it pulls the calcium out of the bone to neutralize the acid. So on calcium supplements, all I can say is there's a few studies that have indicated some positive benefit, but from my reading of it, most studies don't. And in any case, whether it does or doesn't, it's only a minor way of treating the problem, I think. If one went over to really the big issue and go to a plant-based diet, you know, it'd be a lot better. I know somebody that's actually has done that and done it with great success. But you know, I'm not going to dispute the fact that there are some studies that seem to slow down calcium loss. Whether that actually leads to, you know, lower fracture rate or not, that's much more problematic. You know, now, the second question you had, arthritis. Oh yes, well, there's different kinds of arthritis, by the way, as you know, again, the chief culprit appears to be dairy, as far as accelerating the arthritic process. And that information, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, comes from clinicians. Dr. John McDougall, some of you may know that name. In fact, he's been around a long time practicing. And he claims that he's able to really attenuate or even reduce or eliminate arthritic problems in a large percentage of his patients when he gets them over to a plant-based diet, and it happens fairly quickly. But not all, not all. It's a complicated disease, and there's different factors that can lead to that, but certainly one of the best things that can be done, again, is to avoid dairy and go to a plant-based diet.
I certainly want to congratulate Dr. Campbell on the China study. I've probably sold more books than anybody in this audience, health books. I've never had any meat products in my stomach, no chicken, no fish, no beef, plant-based all my life. But the China study is the best thing I've ever read outside of Ellen White's books, which led me to plant-based foods many, many years ago. So congratulations, get that book, get Ellen White's books, and put them together.
Thank you very much.
Could you possibly address the vitamin B12 issue, please? The vitamin B12?
Vitamin B12, yes. First of all, let me make a general statement, but not exaggerate it too much. Taking nutrient supplements, to me, is not nutrition, it's pharmacology. It's just early pharmacology, it's not nutrition. So I think there's the hype that surrounded the use of supplements over the years has been greatly exaggerated. People spend a lot of money just to create expensive urine, for the most part, without getting any benefits. And all the studies that we've been doing on this serious studies testing the effect of vitamin supplements have now yielded a couple of really significant reports in the last couple of years, basically summarizing and say we don't see effects, not even from vitamin C, vitamin E, or anything else. but you know, the circus goes on. People keep discovering new things. But I will make an exception for vitamin B12. People who are consuming, and I'm basing this in large measure on my clinical friends, even though I still think the jury is out a bit. But they're the ones that's basically telling me that when they see some so-called deficiency of B12 in people who are consuming only plant-based diets, they can restore that to some extent, at least by giving supplements. So some of my clinical friends who are also in favor of the vegan or the plant-based diet, they will argue that it's important to use vitamin B12 supplements, and I go along with that if they say so. There's one other thing that's kind of emerging in recent years, and I just sort of have been made more aware of this during the last year or so. It's something we got to watch. Let me just say it that way, something we got to watch. In the older days, I was involved in this because I was asked by the National Academy of Science to be the chief witness in some Federal Trade Commission hearings in Washington against the idea when it first emerged. Namely, when the nutrient supplement industry was sort of starting, and they were making different kinds of nutrient supplements, single nutrients in pills, or they were sort of creating some dried vegetable matter and putting it in pills. I argued against that. It didn't make biological sense to me. But there is one way it might mean something, and that is, and this has been done now by a couple companies, if not more. In fact, more. It's actually more. They take vegetables and fruits, good quality organic vegetables, fruits, and they freeze dry it within 30 minutes of picking, trying to keep intact as much as possible the biological activity of that stuff. Actually, they freeze dry the juice that's extracted from it. The juice where you take out the fiber, you take out the sugar, and then you take out the water by freeze drying it. And they end up with a very concentrated collection of things that are left over in the fruits and vegetables that, in a sense, includes all this, tens of thousands or whatever it is, all in the right proportion. And so now they're testing this to some extent, and I've looked at some of this literature, and there are some benefits to be obtained, even amongst people who consume a plant-based diet, so the story goes, and limited evidence. What that says, and there's some evidence for this too, is that the vegetables and fruits of this day may not be the same as what they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. We've done a lot of stuff to our vegetables and fruits. We've been doing plant breeding experiments of all kinds to make a hard tomato without being concerned about nutrient content, or we've done other kinds of things. And now there's some evidence to show that we have lost some nutrient content in what was the original form of these vegetables and fruits. And if that's true, all the stuff that I'm standing here telling you about eating vegetables and fruits and grains actually may not be quite enough. It's just something to watch for. I don't want to endorse, things like this, but at the same time, I do want to call it to your attention just in case there is something here. Yeah, question?
What is your opinion on two questions, meat analogs and 2 glyconutrients?
On what kind of?
Meat analogs and then glyconutrients?
Oh, meat analogs and glyconutrients. Yeah, meat analogs, of course, I'm sure you're referring to the fact that you can make meat-like products that taste like meat but are made out of vegetable matter. Yeah, I mean, there's some theoretical advantage, maybe some real advantage, which, again, I mean, I'm a scientist. I like to look at the evidence on the two sides of the equation. I don't see enough evidence to make a really firm, hard conclusion. I do worry a bit about using those meat analogs because they're processed and they're just really accentuating or exacerbating our consumption in some cases of soy protein or textured vegetable protein, which is a highly processed thing. And so as a result, we're consuming protein, yes, from the plant world, but we're consuming it, for some people, we're really getting pretty high levels now. And I'm a little concerned about what that might mean. We might see something similar if we get these high levels. So I think there's a little concern. I'd like to express some concern about using those kind of products. Glycoproteins, I think you're referring to the products that are supposed to help in bone and joint pains and muscle pains, I think. It's become quite popular in recent years to have various kinds of products like that. And again, I tend to be kind of agnostic to the effect of these things of doing anything useful, but I sure hear quite a lot from people who say, I got some benefit. You know, and who am I to dispute? I mean, maybe it's in their head, but if it's in their head, it's okay too, maybe, as long as it's not doing any harm to them. Again, you know, I really do have some respect for the science and for, you know, if they're having real stuff, and I just haven't seen enough yet. Maybe it's because of my ignorance. I haven't seen, you know, obviously all that there is to see. So maybe it, who knows? I said enough. I haven't given you a good answer, I know that. But I'm not convinced that it's that great, but maybe it is, who knows? When I get a sore knee, I'm going to try it and see if it...
All right, I had a question concerning MSG. I understand it's an altered protein. I'm right here. I'm wondering if you came across any research about MSG and the disease of Takayatsu's arteritis.
MSG and...
Takayatsu's arteritis.
I mean, I didn't hear that last phrase.
The Takayatsu's arteritis.
Coffee.
Takayatsu's. It was named after the guy who found it, and he actually did a study from China because they have a heavy MSG diet in
Right.
China.
I don't know that. I don't know that product at all. Haven't heard that name before. MSG, of course, is, you know, it's pretty high in salt content. It's a problem. It's got some other issues with it, and probably not a very good idea to use very much of that, if any at all.
The Takayatsu's is actually a disease that causes heart problems. So since you had done some heart research, I was wondering if you might have bumped into it.
Yeah, I don't know that.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, just on our...
Yeah, hi. I've seen some studies lately that indicate as we move away from the equator that we end up with higher incidences of cancer. And a lot of scientists are relating this to the vitamin D that we get from the sun. I'm wondering if you think it's actually vitamin D, or do our diets change to a more meat-based diet as we move further north?
It's true. As you move from the equator to the poles, either way, north or south, you see substantially more of some of the autoimmune diseases, as well as some of the chronic diseases like breast cancer and the like. And all of that tends to be associated with consuming more meat, and especially more dairy in these regions. And so there can be a reasonable hypothesis made that it's higher in those regions of the world because they're getting less sunlight, therefore less vitamin D. It's hard to separate out exactly what's happening in this case, how important that really is. But I do know, and I reviewed it a little bit in the book, when we're consuming animal-based foods and lots of animal protein, creatine the acid, as I mentioned a couple times, that will tend to diminish the ability of vitamin D that we do get from doing its job. It tends to block the metabolism of the liver form of vitamin D, which is a stored form. It tends to block the conversion of that to the kidney form, which is the business end of the molecule. And so animal protein tends to retard the ability of vitamin D to do anything. Now, whether taking vitamin D supplements overcomes that, there's two issues here. I mean, if we can take vitamin D supplements, if in theory we think it's a reasonable idea, we can take it and still consume on this really bad diet. And who knows? We might get some short-term benefit. I don't think so in the long run. But it's not the kind of answer to get, you know, if you want to think of it more holistically. Change the diet, and that's much less likely to be a problem. Much less likely to be a problem. There's a second problem with the vitamin D story, too, and that is the fact that clinicians, if there's any clinicians in the room, you might know this, much of the research on vitamin D and the ideas about vitamin D have been based on measuring the storage form of vitamin D, which in my view is not a reliable way of measuring vitamin D status. So, and there's a lot of hype out there right now in getting people to use vitamin D supplements, especially in places like Oregon. Maybe not here in Walla Walla, but certainly over on the western coast, because there's not enough sunshine. And again, I don't get very excited about any of those supplements. If you do the diet right, then the question arises: how much more do you need to do if you do that? And so, again, don't fully know the answer.
We'll do one more question and then we'll need to close. Thank you.
Yes, I see.
When people take in animal protein, the excretion of the amino acid, of course, you get an acidic environment, which leads to increased calcium excretion as well. So would plant proteins not have a similar effect?
No. No, it tends not to. There are, some of the cereal grains can, in fact, have been demonstrated to create a bit of an acidic environment under some circumstances. I'm not sure exactly why. But the acidic environment is created by animal-based proteins primarily is related to their higher levels of the sulfur amino acids, if you're familiar with that, which when they get metabolized to the sulfate acidic ion, obviously, it has to be corrected or buffered. So plant proteins tend not to do that. They tend to restore the pH, so it has the opposite effect.
One more question, okay? Sorry. The lady with the yellow mic, yeah, go ahead.
Thank you for your study. I have two questions. Could you please comment on the effect of arachidonic acid caused by eating animal products? And secondly, you spoke about hydration, and there seems to be controversy about drinking distilled water as opposed to either water created by reverse osmosis or even mineralized water. Thank you.
Well, the arachidonic acid question, that's pretty complicated, and I certainly do not know all the ins and outs of that. What you're talking about is, of course, the ability of arachidonic acid to produce other products or be produced by certain kinds of fatty acids, and restoring the balance of the omega-3s and omega-6s in particular, and its effect. And there's quite a lot of interest in, giving some products to, like omega-3 fats, for example, to restore that balance. Actually, it turns out we actually measured in our China study the content of the omega-3 so-called fats and omega-6 fats, as well as all the other fatty acids in red blood cell membranes of these people in the study. And what we found was that the people who were nearest a plant-based diet didn't have problems with this fatty acid problem. And so I think the DHA, the arachidonic acid, the omega-3s, omega-6 is part of that story that's now emerging and becoming quite popular, so that we create products to sell, to do this, that, something else, not realizing, even the researchers don't fully realize this, realizing we can obtain the nearest thing to the ideal composition of those fatty acids just by consuming a plant-based diet. As far as the water, this is one of the amazing things. You might think that I'm always searching for answers to try to prove a plant-based diet, but I have to guard against that, actually. But what I find about this plant-based diet idea, it has such a breadth of effect, and it really does. And I keep seeing all this new stuff that comes up all the time that sort of expands the story and makes it even more profound. As far as water is concerned, gee, I don't know on that one. You people are really asking me tough questions. Why are you making it so hard on me? On the water thing, I don't know, deionized water or however else it's purified, and whether you take the minerals out or leave them in or something like that. The jury's out. That's all I can say. In science, we got to stand back and take a look and see what's happening to people who are doing these different, various and sundry ways. I do have to say one thing. Our water supply in this country is bad, especially in urban areas. Well, in rural areas too, for gosh sakes. In rural areas, the leakage, seepage, maybe the right thing. The seepage of nitrates, for example, from intensive farming practices, especially involving pig farming in particular, and maybe chicken farming, and it's getting into well water, and well, you know the story. You know better than I do. I mean, it's a bit of a problem. And we gotta remain hydrated. It's a part of the story that hasn't been told very well. We gotta have enough water all the time, because it's really important. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Campbell. Thank you for coming. You probably know we have meetings tomorrow if you're interested. 2 o'clock at WAVA Auditorium and 7 o'clock at WAVA Auditorium. So we hope to see you there. Have a good evening. Thank you so much for coming.